She finished the brake job before she drove to the hospital. That is the thing most people never understood about Della Bowen. Not because they were unkind, not because they lacked imagination or sympathy, but because they had never watched her work, had never seen the particular way she moved through a task once she had started it, with the specific purposefulness of a woman who had absorbed at some cellular level that a half-finished thing was its own category of damage. A thing that would sit in the world doing its particular harm until someone returned to complete what had been left undone. The fleet vehicle had come in that morning for a routine pad replacement on all four corners. She had pulled the first two wheels before 7:45. When her phone rang at 9:12, she was 3 bolts from finishing the last one. She finished the 3 bolts. She set the lug wrench down on the floor mat she used to protect her knees. She lowered the lift. She backed the vehicle into its spot in the lot with the practiced ease of 22 years of doing exactly this. Then she wiped her hands on the shop rag she kept folded in the back pocket of her coveralls, the same blue rag her father had kept in the same pocket of his own coveralls for as long as she had been paying attention to such things. She walked to her truck in the lot. She got in. She drove to Sheridan Memorial Hospital on the south end of town. She did not cry on the way there. She did not cry in the elevator, or in the corridor outside the cardiac unit, or in the plastic chair in the waiting area, where she sat with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes on the door. She had been sitting there for 2 hours and 14 minutes when the doctor came through the door, and she already knew from the specific weight in his walk what he was going to tell her. She had known it from the sound of her aunt's voice on the phone. Even before her aunt had finished the sentence, she was trying to form the way, certain things not through reasoning, but through some older, faster system in the body that receives particular categories of information before the conscious mind has finished processing what it has heard. The doctor told her what she already knew. She cried once. In the parking garage, on level 2 alone, between a mud-caked Ford F-150 and a concrete support pillar for 11 minutes by her watch. She counted the minutes without deciding to which was a habit Earl had given her across 35 years of close proximity, the habit of measuring things precisely so that you could account for them and move through them and not let them expand beyond their actual size. Earl Bowen had been a man who believed, with the patient and unarguable conviction of someone who had built everything he owned with his own 2 hands, that most of the difficulty people experienced in life came directly from their failure to know exactly what they were dealing with. Get the measurement right, he had said more times than she could count, and the rest is just work. After 11 minutes, she drove back to the shop and finished the rest of the day's appointments. 4 vehicles, 3 invoices paid on the spot, and 1 that would require a follow-up call on Friday. She swept the bay before she locked up. She reset the alarm. She drove home on Route 9 the way she drove it every evening, noting the frost forming on the margins of the road and the dark sky settling over the flat country east of town. And she did not think about the hospital or the doctor or the 2 hours and 14 minutes in the plastic chair. She thought about the differential job scheduled for Thursday and whether the parts she had ordered would arrive in time and whether she should call the supplier in the morning or wait until afternoon. That was 14 months ago. Bowen Auto and Repair sat on Route 9 on the eastern edge of Sheridan, Wyoming, in a long, low building that Earl had constructed himself in the autumn of 1988, with secondhand lumber purchased from a salvage yard in Buffalo, and help from 3 men whose names Della had grown up hearing at the dinner table with the same regularity and familiarity as the names of relatives. The sign out front was wood rather than the metal that most commercial signs were made from, because metal cost considerably more, and Earl had not believed in spending money on appearances when there was equipment to acquire and a loan from First Mountain Bank to service. He had cut the letters himself from a piece of 1-inch pine and painted them on a Saturday morning in late September, while Della, who was not yet 4 years old, sat on an overturned oil drum 20 feet away and watched him work. She could not remember that morning from her own memory. She had been told about it often enough and with enough specific detail that the memory felt genuinely hers, but she understood the difference between a memory she owned and a story she had absorbed so thoroughly it had taken on the texture of memory. What she actually remembered from the years she was old enough to retain things was later. The smell of the shop before the lights came on in the morning, cold concrete and old grease, and something underneath those 2 things that she had never been able to name with any precision, something that was simply the building itself. the specific air of a place that had been worked in honestly for a long time and had accumulated that honesty into its walls and floors, the way old wood accumulates the weather it has survived. She had grown up on that smell. She had grown up on this concrete floor with these tools under these vehicles. Earl had taught her to change a tire when she was 7 years old, not because he needed her to be able to do it, but because he believed with the particular stubbornness of a man who has built everything he owns by hand, that his daughter should understand the function of every single thing in her world. He had taught her with the same method he used for everything else, demonstrating one and slowly and then watching her do it and correcting only what needed correcting and saying nothing further about it afterward. By the time she was 12, she could read an engine the way other 12-year-olds read books. By 14, she had rebuilt her first transmission, a 1973 Chevrolet three-quarter-ton pickup that belonged to a rancher named Dale, who brought it in every spring without fail, and always paid in cash, and always left a folded 20 on the counter before he walked out, folded twice placed near the register, without comment or explanation, and specifically intended for Della, which both of them understood without the matter ever being discussed. She had worked beside her father for 22 years after that, not because she was required to, not because she lacked other options, or because the shop was the only thing available to her, because there was no place she wanted to be more than this building, with these tools beside this man, doing work that was honest and that mattered and that she was genuinely good at. She was better than good at it. She was excellent, and she had become excellent through the same method Earl had used for everything he had ever mastered, which was attention and repetition and the willingness to be wrong when she was wrong, and to correct it and not repeat the error. Earl Bowen had died on a Thursday morning in March, 14 months before the night in October, when Curtis Vane kicked the front glass case in and came through the door of Bowen Auto and Repair with two men behind him. He had left behind the shop which was paid for. He had left behind a truck and a complete set of tools and 22 years of customer relationships and a reputation in the Sheridan area that was, as far as Della could determine, entirely deserved. He had also left behind a loan at First Mountain Bank with a remaining balance of $47,300, which represented the refinancing he had done 3 years before his death, when the original equipment loan had been restructured to cover the cost of the new lift and the alignment rack. The bank had been patient with her in the way that lending institutions are patient when their patience is still within the boundaries of their own interest. But patience, she had come to understand across the 14 months since Earl's death, was not the same as forgiveness. And the monthly statements had been arriving with a tone she recognized from the way certain customers spoke to her in the period just before they told her they could not pay for work she had already completed and would not be compensating her for. She was working 6 days a week, 10 hours most days more on days when something had run long or a customer had called with an emergency she could not turn away. She kept the evening shifts herself to reduce what she paid to her one part-time employee, a young man named Garrett, who came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and did not yet know enough to be left alone with certain jobs, but who had the essential quality of showing up when he was expected to, which she had learned was less common than it should be. She was 3 months behind on the second payment installment of the restructured schedule. She had not told anyone this because there was no one to tell who could do anything about it, and telling people things they cannot act on was a form of complaint she had not been raised to find useful. On the morning of the Tuesday in October, the morning of the day, the evening of which would change several things she thought she understood about her life, and about her father, and about what it meant to have someone stay, she had been under a Ford F-250 at 7:15 in the morning, replacing a rear differential that had been making a grinding sound its owner had ignored since the previous spring, and which had finally deteriorated past the point of being ignorable. The call from the bank had come at 8:17. She had looked at the number on her phone screen, recognized it, and let it go to voicemail. She finished the differential. She stood up from under the truck, wiped her hands, and listened to the message, standing in the bay, with the differential job's paperwork still in her hand and the engine of the truck ticking beside her as it cooled. The payment was short by $1,214. The bank was prepared to work with her, the message said, in the specific cadence that financial institutions use when they are not in fact prepared to work with you in any meaningful sense of the phrase, but who understand the value of maintaining the appearance of willingness. She had until the end of the month. She had, by her calculation, approximately $900 in the operating account after her next payroll run and before the parts invoices due the following week. She put the phone in her coverall pocket and took the next vehicle off the lot. That was how Della Bowen handled things. Not because she did not feel them. She felt everything that came to her, the phone call, and the number and the gap between what she had and what was needed. She felt it in the specific way you feel something when you have decided in advance that feeling it is not going to change anything about the situation, so you might as well keep your hands on the work. Earl had operated exactly this way. For most of her life, she had thought it was a flaw in him, a kind of emotional avoidance that looked like strength, but was really just a refusal to acknowledge difficulty. She had since revised that assessment. She had come to believe that it was in fact a form of strength and that the distinction between the two was made clear by what you produced. Earl had produced 35 years of honest work in a business that stood on its own and a daughter who knew what she was doing. She was trying to produce the same. It was 2 weeks before that Tuesday evening on a Sunday night when she was closing out the register and the lot was empty and the bay was quiet that Della had done the thing Earl had taught her to do about things that felt wrong. She had been counting the drawer when she noticed the car moving on Route 9. A dark sedan moving at the particular pace of a vehicle whose driver is paying more attention to what is on either side of the road than to where the road is going. She watched it from the front window. It passed the lot entrance without turning in. It continued to the intersection 200 yards east, and then instead of continuing, it came back. Same direction, same pace. She reached under the register shelf and tore a strip from the notepad Earl had kept there for 35 years. Not for invoices, not for parts orders or customer callbacks, for the other category of information. The truck that had sat in the lot for 2 hours with no one visible in or around it. The man who had stood at the front window asking about her hours when her hours were posted on the door in letters large enough to read from the parking lot. The pattern that felt like something even when nothing specific had happened yet. Earl had told her once in the plain and efficient way he communicated things that mattered, that a woman alone in a building needed to develop the habit of recording what felt wrong before her own reasoning could talk her out of it. The notes were not for anyone else. They were for herself so that if the wrongness accumulated into something definite, she would have the record of when it had started. She wrote the plate number on the strip of paper and placed it in the drawer beneath the cash tray next to Earl's spare key to the back door. She set the alarm and drove home. She noted without particular attention on her way out of the lot the dark sedan parked 2 properties east of the shop beside the closed bait shop with its engine off. She noted it and put it in the same mental folder as the strip of paper in the drawer. Something that felt wrong but had not yet resolved into something definite. She saw the sedan again on Tuesday evening, and then she did not see it again until it was already inside. The man in the corner chair had been coming in on Wednesday mornings since the previous spring. His name, as far as Della knew, it was Grady Mercer. He was 61 years old, though he carried those years in the way of a man for whom age had been a process of accumulation rather than erosion. Someone upon whom time had deposited things rather than simply taking them away. His hair was gray and cut close and always neat. He wore flannel shirts in blue or green, always clean, always with the collar open and the sleeves turned back to the elbow. He drank whatever was in the coffee pot without inquiring about it first and without commenting on it afterward. He occupied the same corner chair every Wednesday, the chair nearest the window that looked out onto the lot and Route 9 beyond, and he read whatever magazines happened to be on the side table, regardless of their subject matter, or how many months had elapsed since their publication, with the calm and undistracted attention of a man who was using the reading as a way of being present in a place rather than as a way of acquiring information. He always brought the Harley, a 2004 Road King in the original black and chrome that showed its age in the way well-maintained things show their age with a kind of distinguished wear rather than deterioration. He always requested the same service. He always paid in cash in full without asking about the charge, and he always paid exactly what the invoice said, which meant he read the invoice, which meant he was paying attention to things. Other people in his position tended to take for granted. Della had determined by the middle of the second month that the motorcycle did not need the service he was bringing it in for. She had said nothing about this. He had offered no explanation. There are arrangements between people that both parties understand without the understanding needing to be stated, and this was one of those arrangements. She performed the service he paid for. He sat in the corner chair and drank the coffee and left when she handed him the keys. The other regulars, the customers who came in repeatedly and who over time had developed the casual familiarity with the shop and with Della that regulars develop, had gradually stopped trying to draw Grady Mercer into conversation. Not because he was rude. He was never rude. He was polite in a specific way that left no room for misunderstanding. The way a man is polite when he has decided exactly where his courtesy begins and ends and has made that decision for reasons he does not feel obligated to share. His answers to conversational questions were sufficient and no longer than sufficient, and after enough of them, people stopped asking questions they already knew the shape of the answer to. What Della knew about Grady Mercer had been assembled over the months, the way you assemble a picture when someone provides only the pieces that are necessary and withholds the rest. He had come to Sheridan 3 years ago in October on a Tuesday afternoon with one duffel bag and the Harley, and no plans beyond stopping. He had told her this when she asked in the early weeks in the way you ask a new regular where they had come from. And he had answered it in the same spirit in which she had asked factually, and without the additional texture that people sometimes add to indicate they are willing to keep talking about it. He had said he had been moving for a while and had decided to stop, and that Sheridan was where that happened. He rented a room above the hardware store on Elm Street, which was on the intake form. He paid for everything in cash. No one had ever called the shop asking for him, which in a town of Sheridan's size meant something definite about the nature of his connections there. She did not know what he had been before Sheridan. She had a sense assembled from small observations across many Wednesdays that what he had been was significant and that he had chosen deliberately and completely to stop being it. She did not examine this sense directly. There were things you understood better by keeping them at the edge of your attention. And Earl had taught her to know the difference between the things that required direct examination and the things that were better left in peripheral vision. What she did not know would not know until the April evening that changed the shape of several things she thought she understood about her father and about why this particular man had been occupying the corner chair every Wednesday morning since the previous spring, was that Grady Mercer had stood across Route 9 from the Bowen Auto and Repair sign for 20 minutes. The first afternoon he arrived in Sheridan, sitting on the idling Harley with his feet on the ground and his eyes on the wooden sign Earl had painted in September of 1988 before he ever dismounted and walked through the door. That knowledge would come in April. What came before it on 2 Sundays and 1 Tuesday evening, in the weeks leading up to that October night, was the dark sedan moving slowly past the lit shop on Route 9 after closing and the strip of notepad paper in the drawer beneath the cash tray, in a sense that she had been carrying since the first Sunday without quite letting herself name it. The April evening came 6 months before the night Curtis Vane came through the door. Grady had been the last customer of the day. Della had finished with the Harley by 7:30, confirmed what she already knew, which was that there was nothing wrong with it and nothing that needed doing to it, and logged the service in the book the way she logged every service with the date and the mileage and the work performed and the amount paid. He had been sitting in the corner chair long enough during her work on the bike that she had refilled his coffee twice without being asked, which was not something she did for customers as a general practice. She was not a diner. She was a shop. But there was something in the quality of his being there, in the specific way he occupied the chair, without making demands on the space around him, that had installed itself over the preceding months as something she accommodated without having consciously decided to accommodate it. Outside, the evening light had gone flat and gray in the way of April evenings in Wyoming, the sky surrendering its color early and the temperature dropping with it, the lot empty except for his Harley near the fence and her truck by the side door. The highway noise had thinned to the occasional passing semi, the particular silence that settles over a road edge business when the last customer has gone and the work of the day is technically complete, but the closing tasks remain. A silence that was neither empty nor uncomfortable, but simply the sound of a place at rest had settled over Bowen Auto and Repair with its usual reliability. She was counting the register drawer when she said it, not looking at him, not framing it as a request for his opinion or as an invitation to a conversation she had planned. Just saying it into the air of the shop, the way you eventually say things you have been carrying for long enough that carrying them alone has become its own form of weight. Third time this week, somebody has driven past after closing and slowed down, she said. Grady did not answer immediately. He set his paper coffee cup on his knee and looked at the front window with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he was taking seriously. Same car, she said. Different nights, but the same car. Same slow. He nodded once. A small motion. The nod of a man who has been expecting a confirmation and has now received it. Della returned the register drawer to its position and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. She was not a woman who asked for help. Earl had not raised her to be, and she had not chosen to become one independently. The asking felt to her like a kind of admission that the situation was larger than she could handle on her own, and she was not yet ready to make that admission. But she was also not a woman who pretended not to see things she could plainly see, and what she could plainly see was that she was alone in this building 6 evenings a week, and the building sat on a stretch of Route 9 where the nearest neighbor was a bait shop that had been closed for 3 seasons and showed no signs of reopening. "You ever think about getting a dog?" Grady said. "Can't afford a dog right now." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him in the months he had been coming, in a brief relaxation around the eyes that did not quite reach the point of a visible change in expression, and that was gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the coffee cup on the table beside the chair and stood up. He walked to the work table beside the register, the table where Della kept the most frequently used hand tools laid out in order, the order Earl had established over 35 years of use, and that she maintained without deliberate thought because the arrangement had become part of how the shop worked, and changing it would have introduced a small daily friction that served no purpose. He picked up the 19mm combination wrench from its spot on the table, turned it once in his hand, examining it the way a person examines a familiar object and they are seeing for the first time in a particular context. Then he placed it back on the table, but upside down from how it had been lying. "You know what that means," he said. "Means someone put it back wrong," Della said. "It means something else in certain places," Grady said. "To certain people who were taught to pay attention to it." He looked at the wrench for a moment before continuing. "In the chapter I was in, he said there was a signal. If something felt wrong during a meeting, if someone was in the room who shouldn't have been there, if the situation was developing in a direction that required people to hold their positions without making that need explicit, you would flip a wrench on the workbench. Anybody who knew what it meant understood, do not leave, do not make a move. Stay exactly where you are and wait to see what the next few minutes bring." Della looked at the wrench, then she looked at him. "Your father used it," Grady said. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. He let it sit. He understood, she could tell, that what he had just placed in the room would need a moment before she could receive what he intended to follow it. Earl Bowen was a prospect with Iron Ridge MC in 1985, Grady said. "Before he left the chapter and opened this shop 3 years later. I was a full patch member in that chapter for the 2 years he was a prospect. I knew his name, and I knew what kind of man he was, which was the kind of man the chapter recognized as someone who did what he committed to doing and did not perform any of it. He left when he left, and he left the way certain men leave when they have made a genuine decision rather than an exit, and the chapter let him go without difficulty because that is what you do for a man like that." He paused. He looked at the wrench on the table between them. "When I came through Sheridan 3 years ago," he said, "I drove east on Route 9 and I saw the sign on this building." He said the next part, the way you say something that was once a very large fact and has since settled into being simply a fact, without the weight it once carried, but without losing its truth. "I sat across the road for 20 minutes before I walked in. I came in because the name on the sign was Earl Bowen's name, and because a man who left what he left to build what he built deserved to have someone paying attention to what was happening around it." Della did not say anything. She was in that moment in the particular condition of a person who has just learned that a substantial portion of what they believed they knew about someone they loved completely was, if not wrong, incomplete in a way that changed the shape of what they knew. Earl had told her many things across 35 years of proximity. He had told her about the shop and about the tools and about the right way to listen to an engine and the wrong way to trust a customer who asked too many questions about what other customers paid. He had told her about her mother who had died when Della was 2 in the careful and honest way Earl did everything without sentimentality and without omission. He had told her about money and about debt and about the specific kind of patience required to build something sustainable in a place where sustainable things were not always easy to build. He had never said the word chapter, had never said the words Iron Ridge, had never described the years before 1988 as anything other than the years before the shop. And she had accepted that framing because she had no reason to question it, and because Earl was not a man who invited questions about what he did not volunteer. It is a specific kind of disorientation, discovering that the person you knew most completely in the world had an entire history inside them that they chose not to share. Not because they were ashamed of it necessarily, not because it reflected poorly on them or on anyone connected to them, but because they had put it behind them with the same thoroughness they brought to everything else, and they did not see the need to carry it forward into a life that had been built deliberately and at some cost in a different direction. Grady picked up his jacket from the back of the corner chair. He shook it on. Then he stopped at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Get it? If there is ever a night when someone comes into this shop and you need someone to not leave, he said, put that wrench upside down on the table. I will see it. She looked at him for a moment. And if you are not here, she said. I will be here, Grady said. He walked out. The bell above the door rang once and settled. She stood at the counter and watched his taillights move south on Route 9 until the road's curve took them out of view. Then she reached out and turned the wrench right side up and placed it back in its spot and went back to the register and finished closing out the drawer. She did not think about it again in any deliberate way, but on the night she worked late, which were most nights, more nights than Earl would have allowed if he had still been present to have an opinion about it, she noticed without exactly deciding to that the wrench was always within reach, always on the table, always in the spot where it belonged. It was there on the Tuesday in October. Curtis Vane had built his system over 6 years with the patience and methodical care of a man who understands that the difference between something that works and something that fails is almost always in the preparation. He had started at 27 with 2 men he had known since their school years in a small town outside Casper, men who were reliable in the specific way that people are reliable when the alternative to reliability is worse than the effort reliability requires. His initial idea was simple enough that its simplicity was itself a form of sophistication. Small independent businesses operated on cash in ways that larger and more scrutinized enterprises did not. The owners of those businesses were almost without exception people who had invested everything they had into what they were running and who understood at a visceral level that losing it was not an abstract possibility, but a concrete and proximate threat. The distance between those two facts was where the opportunity existed, and Curtis Vane had walked into that distance and established himself there with 11 successful operations across 3 states. He was thorough in a way that distinguished him from people who did similar things for similar reasons. He scouted each location a minimum of 3 times before making any approach, always at different times of day and on different days of the week, always from sufficient distance to observe without being observed. He noted sight lines and traffic patterns and the locations and operational status of exterior lighting. He noted the position of cash registers relative to windows and the approximate distances between interior features. He noted who was present and in what configuration and at what hours. He noted what was absent, which was often more informative. He did not write any of this down. Writing things down was for people who were not paying close enough attention to retain what they observed, and Curtis Vane paid extremely close attention. He had driven past Bowen Auto and Repair on Route 9 for the first time on a Thursday evening in late September, traveling east for no particular reason, and had slowed without consciously deciding to slow when the lit bay came into view through the passenger window. He had noted the woman working alone under a vehicle with the roll-up door open, the position of the register visible through the front glass, the distance from the nearest intersection, the street light on the eastern utility pole with its bulb long dead and apparently not considered worth replacing by whoever was responsible for it. He had circled twice that first night before continuing. He had come back on a Sunday evening 2 weeks later and parked a block east with his lights off and observed for 40 minutes. He had noted the woman at the front window watching the road at one point, which he registered as a habit of ordinary vigilance rather than specific awareness. And he had noted the old man in the corner chair reading a magazine and drinking from a paper cup. And he had registered the old man the way he registered furniture, as something present in the room that was not relevant to his purpose. He had come back again on a Tuesday night earlier in the month and confirmed what he had already determined. He had assigned the location to the following week's schedule. He had not seen the woman at the front window writing something on a strip of paper and placing it in the register drawer. He had been at the moment she did this on the far side of a parked vehicle with his angle of observation limited by the window frame. He had not seen the paper. He did not know it existed. This was the first thing Curtis Vane did not know that mattered. The second thing he did not know was what the old man in the corner chair had been, and what the old man in the corner chair still was, regardless of the flannel shirt and the bad coffee and the 8-month-old magazine, and the fact that he had sat in that chair on enough Wednesday mornings to become as invisible as any other piece of furniture. On the Tuesday in October, Grady Mercer had arrived at the shop at 6:51 in the evening. He had not set out for the shop. He had been on the Harley heading toward the south end of town, in a diner he used when he did not want to cook, and he had turned onto Route 9 instead of continuing on the road that would have taken him to the diner, the turn made without a conscious decision, the way certain turns are made by the body before the mind has finished deliberating. He had been troubled for several days by a sense that the pattern he had been observing, the pattern of the dark sedan moving past the shop on the evenings when Della was working late, had shifted from the category of something worth watching to the category of something approaching a decision point. He could not have said precisely what had changed. It was the kind of knowledge that the body assembled from small observations over time and presented not as a reasoned conclusion, but as a certainty without clear antecedents. He had come down Route 9 with the sun already gone in the early dark of the Wyoming October, settling over the valley, and he had seen the bay light from 300 yards out and had made the turn into the lot without stopping to consider whether it was the right thing to do. He pulled to the far edge of the lot near the fence and parked there. Della had come out of the bay when she heard the bike. "You just had this bike in 2 days ago," she said. "Heard something on the way over," Grady said. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at the bike. "Pull it in," she said. He sat in the corner chair and read the magazine and drank the coffee she poured without being asked, and she went through the Harley with the thoroughness she brought to everything, checked what could be checked, listened for what could be heard, found nothing that needed addressing because there was nothing to find, and wrote up the service log with the same specificity she applied to every service log, regardless of whether the service had produced any findings. Outside, the lot darkened. The Route 9 traffic thinned to the occasional truck. At 8:45, he looked up from the magazine. The dark sedan he had seen on his way down Route 9 parked 2 lots east when he passed it had moved. It was now across the road in the lot beside the closed bait shop engine running positioned with a view of the shop's front window and the entrance to the lot. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at the magazine. Della was in the back of the shop working on a clutch assembly that needed to be finished by 7 the following morning. She had not seen the sedan. At 9:15, the sedan pulled out and went north. At 9:22, it came back south and parked 2 lots down from the bait shop engine off. Grady set the magazine on his knee. At 9:40, he heard a second engine arrive from the north, then a third from the east, both going quiet quickly in the darkness past the range of the one working street lamp. He did not say anything to Della. There was nothing he could say that would be more useful than what he was already doing, which was staying in position and waiting for the shape of the next few minutes to become clear enough to act within it. He had learned this across 20 years of situations that required exactly this discipline. The most dangerous error available to a man in a position like his was moving before the full shape of the thing he was moving into had declared itself. You moved too soon, and you moved into something you could have avoided or into something worse than what would have come to you if you had waited. You waited until the shape was clear, and then you moved without hesitation. At 9:47, the front door opened. The glass case to the left of the entrance went first a single kick that was practiced enough to be efficient. 3 men were inside in under 30 seconds. The large one, whose name was Marcus, came straight across the floor and took Della by the arm and moved her into the pegboard wall with the unhesitating directness of a man who had performed exactly this action enough times to have removed all uncertainty from it. The hooks on the pegboard caught the back of her coverall. A wrench her father had hung on that wall in 1991 dropped and rang off the concrete floor and came to rest near the base of the wall. Neither Marcus nor Della looked at it. The second man moved directly to the register. The third man, Odell, took a flashlight into the repair bay, moving through it with the deliberate and unhurried pace of someone who had studied the layout from a position of prior observation. None of the 3 had spoken since they came through the door. That silence was what stopped Della's breathing for a moment. Not the entrance itself, not the broken glass or the men or the hand on her arm. The silence between them. Professional silence. The silence of people who have done this enough times that they no longer need to communicate about it verbally because every element has been assigned and understood in advance. At the edge of her vision in the corner chair near the waiting area window, Grady Mercer placed the magazine on the table beside the chair and set both hands flat on his thighs. His eyes came up, level, alert, with an expression she could not have named at that moment, but which she would later understand as the expression of a man who has arrived at a moment he prepared for and who finds arriving at it that the preparation was sufficient. Della's back was against the pegboard wall. Marcus had his forearm across her collarbone at a pressure that communicated possibility without yet achieving it. Her feet were not fully on the floor. Her right hand hanging at her side was approximately 3 feet from the work table edge. She moved her hand without looking at it, found the handle of the 19-millimeter wrench, placed it on the table upside down. One motion, the motion she used for every tool in this shop on every day she worked here, efficient and unhurried, as though it were simply the next thing on the list of things that needed doing tonight. Marcus was watching the register. He did not see it. In the corner chair, Grady Mercer stood up. Marcus registered the movement. He looked over his shoulder, assessed the old man in the flannel shirt rising from the chair, made the calculation that men in his position make when they see something they have decided in advance is not a problem. He made the calculation incorrectly. He released Della and came across the waiting area with the certainty of a man who has done this particular thing many times and found it to be reliable. He took Grady by both shoulders. What happened in the next 3 seconds was brief enough that Della would later struggle to reconstruct it in sequence. Grady's left hand came up and found Marcus's right wrist and did something that required almost no visible force, something small and precise. And then Marcus was on the floor on his back, with his wrist at an angle that his brain was having significant difficulty processing, and his body had not yet decided how to respond to. Grady was standing in the same position he had been standing in, hands at his sides, breathing unchanged. His expression had not altered. Marcus did not get up. The flashlight in the bay went still. Odell came through the bay door, quickly, registered Marcus on the floor, registered the old man standing over the place where Marcus had been standing, ran the rapid internal arithmetic of a situation that had changed in a way he had not anticipated, and arrived at the decision that confused and angry men frequently arrive at, which was to act on the anger rather than the confusion. He came across the waiting area with his right hand forward. Grady stepped left. A single step, the step you take to move around something on a sidewalk, unhurried and without apparent effort. Odell's hand went past his ear. Grady's elbow moved back and connected with the side of Odell's head with the efficiency of a motion that had been performed enough times to require no thought. Odell's legs stopped working reliably beneath him. He caught the edge of the side table on his way to the floor and brought it and its magazines with him. Nobody looked at the magazines. The shop was completely quiet. Curtis Vane had not moved from the position he had taken when he entered. He was 6 feet from Della and 12 feet from Grady Mercer, and he was doing something with his mind that he had not done in 11 previous rooms, which was trying to reconcile what he had planned with what was in front of him and finding that the reconciliation was not coming. His eyes went from Marcus to Odell, from Odell to the old man in the flannel shirt who was standing in the center of the waiting area with his hands at his sides and his coffee cup still sitting on the table where he had set it when he stood up. There was no expression on Grady's face that Curtis had a name for. It was not anger, which Curtis knew and had seen. It was not satisfaction, which he also knew. It was not the performance of calm, which is a thing you can identify by what it is trying to suppress. It was simply presence, the specific, undiluted presence of a man who was precisely where he chose to be and who has no competing interest in being anywhere else. Curtis had built everything he had built on his ability to read a room in the first 30 seconds, to determine who mattered and who did not, to assign correctly. He had assigned the old man in the corner chair to the category of things that were present and not relevant. He understood now that this had been the fundamental error on which all the other errors of the evening were built. His hand moved to his waistband. The gun came out. He brought it up across 12 feet of concrete and leveled it at Grady's chest. His hand was steadier than his sense of the situation, which was the one thing still performing correctly. Grady looked at the gun, then he looked at Curtis. He did not step back. He did not change his posture or his breathing, or the quality of stillness he had been radiating since the moment he stood up from the chair. He looked at Curtis with the expression of a man looking at the outcome of something whose outcome he has already determined. "You don't want to do that," Grady said. "Not a warning and not a plea. The way you tell someone useful information about a stove. Plain and patient, and genuinely without any wish for the information to be disregarded, because disregarding it will not serve anyone present." Curtis's jaw tightened. The gun did not move, but his eyes were doing something that his eyes had not done in 11 previous rooms, in 11 previous moments, that had felt from his side of them identical to this one. His eyes were uncertain. Across the shop, against the pegboard wall with the hooks still in the fabric of her coverall, and her feet finding the floor beneath her, Della was watching the old man in the flannel shirt stand with a gun at his chest, and thinking one thing, holding it with a clarity she would remember precisely for a long time afterward. He is not afraid, not managing fear, not performing calm over something that was fighting to come through. Simply not afraid in the way of someone for whom this particular configuration of threat had been encountered enough times that it no longer carried the power of surprise. The wrench was upside down on the table. The night outside was quiet in the specific way that nights become quiet just before something large and loud moves into them. Curtis Vane had never been in a room where the gun stopped, meaning what a gun is supposed to mean. He had carried one for 6 years. He had used it the way a tradesman uses the most specialized tool in his kit, not primarily for its direct function, but for what its presence communicated to everyone in the room with him. A gun reorganized a room the moment it appeared in one. It moved the center of gravity of every available decision toward the man holding it. It redistributed the weight of every other option until those options became, in practical terms, options no longer. He had relied on this reorganizing effect in 11 rooms across 6 years, and it had not failed him once. It was not reorganizing this room. Grady Mercer was standing 12 feet away with the barrel of Curtis's gun at his sternum, and the room was not reorganizing around the gun. The room was organizing around the man the gun was pointed at, around the specific quality of his stillness, around the expression on his face that Curtis was looking at and could not place in any category of expressions he had encountered in 11 previous rooms. Marcus was on the floor with his wrist. Odell was against the wall near the bay door, with his hand at the side of his head and his legs not yet reliable under him. Curtis ran the accounting the way he always ran the accounting, in rooms that were not developing as expected, and what the accounting returned was a number he had never seen before. The account was not in his favor. 3 steps forward, he told himself. The barrel against the sternum, the authority of the position restored. He took 3 steps forward. He pressed the barrel against Grady's chest. Grady looked down at the point of contact for 1 second. Then he looked up at Curtis. Curtis felt in that look something he did not have a ready word for. He would spend time afterward in the specific and extended quiet of a holding cell trying to find the word, and he would not succeed. It was not defiance. He had seen defiance many times in many rooms, and he knew its texture. Defiance had a heat to it. It was a performance, even when it was also sincere, because it was always working against something, always costing something to maintain. What he saw in Grady Mercer's face cost nothing. It was not working against anything. It was simply present the way the ground is present under a building there before the building was built, and indifferent to whether the building acknowledges it. This man had been here before, not in a room that resembled this one, in this room. This exact room with these exact dimensions of threat and consequence, and the particular quality of air that accumulates when everyone present understands that the next 30 seconds will determine something that cannot be walked back afterward. "On your knees," Curtis said. Grady did not move, did not change the distribution of his weight or the position of his hands or the quality of attention he was paying to the space between them. "On your knees," Curtis said again, and he put more into it, and the more he put into it sounded even to him slightly less like what he intended it to sound like. Grady looked at him with the patience of a man who has been asked questions before that he already knows the answer to, and who waits for the person asking to finish before providing it. "Think about what you are standing in," Grady said. Not a challenge, not an escalation. The tone of a man describing a condition to someone who has not yet fully assessed it. "You came in here for a register and some keys. Think about what it is now. Think about what you chose to make it 4 minutes ago when you raised that gun." "It is whatever I say it is," Curtis said. "No," Grady said. "It stopped being that about 4 minutes ago, and you know it." Something moved across Curtis's face, brief and then controlled. He pressed the barrel harder. Last chance, he said. On your knees right now. Grady looked at him for a long moment. The kind of long that has mass to it. The kind that changes what is in the room. No, Grady said. One word. Flat and complete as a door that has been shut and latched. Curtis had been in rooms with men who were larger than him and angrier and more heavily armed. He had never felt in any of those rooms what he felt in the 2 seconds after that single word. The closest approximation he would find later in the quiet of the cell was this. This man has already decided how this ends and has no fear of the answer he has decided on. Curtis's trigger finger moved. Grady reached into his shirt pocket. The gun hand rose another half-inch. Grady withdrew a phone. He looked at it once. He made a call, 4 words in a voice that did not alter its register for the metal pressed against his sternum. He replaced the phone in his pocket. He looked at Curtis. 12 minutes, Grady said. Use them carefully. Curtis's mouth opened, his mouth closed. Della against the pegboard wall had not moved since Marcus had put her there. The hooks were still in the back of her coverall. Her feet had found the floor, but the rest of her was still in the process of calibrating. She was watching the old man in the flannel shirt stand in the middle of her father's shop with a gun against his chest and speak in a register she recognized as the register of a man who was providing information rather than negotiating for an outcome. She was thinking about the phone call. 4 words. She had not heard them clearly from across the shop, but she had heard their cadence, and their cadence was not the cadence of a request. She was also doing something else, holding in the part of her mind that remained analytical, through conditions that would have shut that part of other people's minds entirely, a piece of information she had placed in a drawer 2 weeks before and had not thought about directly since. A plate number written on a strip of notepad paper, still in the drawer under the cash tray, still there. Curtis Vane stood with a gun pressed against an old man's sternum and felt the word carefully doing something to his sense of the room that he had not been prepared for. To understand what those 2 words did to Curtis Vane, you needed to know what Grady Mercer had been before he was the man in the corner chair. Before the flannel shirt and the bad coffee and the Wednesdays and the 8-month-old magazines and the oil changes performed on a motorcycle that needed nothing done to it. Grady had come up in Iron Ridge, MC, in the period when Iron Ridge was a thing worth coming up in. Not one of the large or nationally recognized organizations, never more than 60 or 70 active members distributed across 3 chapters in Wyoming and Montana, but old in the sense that the men who built it had built it from something real, and the standards they had established had held through conditions that had dissolved larger and better-known organizations entirely. He had prospected at 23. He had been patched at 25. He had spent the 20 years after that in the specific service of the chapter that is not the kind that gets documented, because documentation of that kind of service creates its own category of problem. There were debts owed to him that existed in no ledger that could be produced in any proceeding. There were men still riding who were alive because of decisions Grady had made in rooms that were smaller and darker than this one, and that had been in their specific configurations of threat and consequence, not entirely unlike it. He had left in 2009, not with ceremony and not with conflict. He had stopped showing up, and the men who might have had something to say about that had considered it and said nothing, because Grady Mercer was the kind of man you let go quietly when he decides to go. Some men you hold to their commitments. Other men you recognize when the moment comes as men whose commitments have already been honored beyond any reasonable accounting, and you let them go. The reason he left was his daughter Lena. She had been 19 years old in the autumn of 2009. She lived in Billings with a roommate, worked in a diner on the edge of the University District, attended 2 courses at the community college on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She had her mother's hair and her father's quality of becoming very still when the world around her got loud, which was a quality that looked like calm and was something more specific than calm, and which Grady had recognized in her from the time she was small. He had not been as present in her life as he understood in the accounting he kept privately and honestly that he should have been. He had made the accounting many times, and the number it returned was always the same number, and he had lived with that number the way you live with the things about yourself that cannot be changed retroactively. What happened at a chapter gathering in September of 2009 did not happen while Grady was present. He was in Billings that weekend, though, not near Lena, not near enough to be of any use. One of the senior members of the chapter, a man whose standing within the organization was long, and whose confidence in that standing was complete, had done something at the gathering that was not done. not in the way of an error or a misread situation, with intention. Grady had found out 4 days afterward. He had gone to the chapter president. He had described what he knew without ornamentation or excess, and he had stated what he expected to happen as a consequence of what he had described. The chapter had deliberated. The chapter had reached a conclusion. The conclusion was communicated to Grady in language that was diplomatic in its surface and unambiguous in its substance. The matter had been addressed within the chapter. The matter was resolved. The matter was going forward, not to be raised again. Grady had driven to Billings that night. He had sat in the parking lot of Lena's building until the light in her second-floor window came on. Then he had driven back and said nothing to anyone. For 3 weeks, he had maintained the distance between what he knew and what he was able to do within the structures he had operated within for 20 years. He was not a man who moved before the shape of a thing was clear to him. That discipline had served him across many situations. He held to it now, though holding to it cost considerably more than it usually did. Lena died on a Thursday night in October, not as a direct consequence of what had happened in September. What happened in September had not left a visible mark on her. It had left the other kind, the mark that changes the way a person moves through rooms and through phone calls and through the ordinary days that follow an event that the person who experienced it has decided, for whatever combination of reasons that are entirely their own, not to discuss. Grady had noticed the change in the phone calls. He had not named it correctly in time. She died because no one was there. Not because anyone specifically left. Because the shape of that Thursday night required someone to be present, and the specific person who should have been was not. Grady was at a chapter meeting, the same chapter, the same table, the same men. The man who had been 3 seats to his left at the previous meeting, sitting 3 seats to his left at this one. And Grady had received the call from the roommate at 4 in the morning on Friday, and had driven through the rest of the night to Billings and done what needed to be done in the days that followed. He had gone back to the chapter one final time. He had walked in and said one sentence to the man who had been 3 seats to his left, and he had walked out. He had never returned. He had never filed a formal departure or offered a statement of his reasons, because his reasons were self-evident to anyone paying attention. And he did not conduct his life for the benefit of people who were not paying attention. He had moved. He had put states between himself and what he had been. He had come to Sheridan because it was a place where his name was not known, which had lasted approximately 4 months before the conditions of a small Wyoming town reasserted themselves in their usual way. He had been in Sheridan 4 months when a Tuesday afternoon ride took him east on Route 9, and the sign on the building on the south side of the road came into view. Bowen Auto and Repair, established 1988. He had pulled over across the road. He knew Earl Bowen's name from 1985, from the 2 years they had overlapped in Iron Ridge Earl as a prospect, and Grady in his first years as a full patch member. He had known Earl the way you know someone in those contexts, by their quality of presence, and by what they did when they said they would do it, and by the texture of how they handled the things that could not be planned for. Earl had been 2 years into his prospect period when he made his decision, and his decision had been the kind of decision that certain men make when they have fully understood where the path they are on leads and have concluded that it does not lead where they intend to go. He had communicated the decision, and he had left, and the chapter had let him go, which was the chapter's way of expressing the highest form of respect available to them. Grady had not seen Earl again after that day. He had not looked. Men who departed cleanly deserved to stay departed. But the sign was there on Route 9, and below the name the date, 3 years after Earl left the chapter. 3 years of building towards something, and then this. Grady had sat across the road for 20 minutes with his feet on the ground and the Harley idling beneath him. Then he had crossed the road and walked in and asked for an oil change, and sat in the corner chair and drunk the coffee and come back the following Wednesday. Earl had called him 8 months before that October night. This was not something Grady had mentioned to Della, and it was not something she would learn until she found what was in the bottom drawer of the tool chest, folded in the back corner, under the receipt and the dried-out grease tin. Earl had gotten his number through a man who had been in the chapter years ago and who maintained the particular kind of contact list that people from those years tend to maintain long after the organizations that produced it have changed or dissolved. The call had come on a Wednesday afternoon. Earl's voice had been exactly what Grady would have expected from a man he had known briefly in a different life, which was direct and without excess and organized around what it needed to convey. He had described the situation with the bank. He had described what he saw happening with the road outside the shop after closing. He had asked Grady to look in on the place, not to take any particular action, not to explain himself or alter what was already there, just to be present. Because Earl knew what Grady was, had always known, and understood that Grady's presence in a room was worth more than most arrangements that could be formally established. Earl had died 4 months later on a Thursday morning in March without telling his daughter any of this. Grady had kept coming on Wednesdays. He was in the room now with the gun at his sternum and 12 minutes counting down somewhere outside the immediate frame of the standoff, and Curtis Vane was standing in front of him with his calculation coming back wrong for the first time in 11 previous rooms. Curtis looked at the window. He looked back at Grady. He looked at the window again. "Think about what you have stepped into," Grady said. "You came here for a register and some keys. What you have stepped into is different from that, and you chose to step into it when you raised the gun, instead of taking what you came for and leaving. That choice is already made. What is not yet made is the next one." "It is still whatever I say it is," Curtis said. "But the thing that was supposed to give that sentence its authority was not fully present in it." "No," Grady said. "Not for several minutes now." Curtis pressed the barrel against Grady's sternum hard enough now to constitute its own kind of statement. "Last chance," he said. "On your knees, right now." Grady looked at him for a long moment. The air in the room changed slightly, the way air changes in rooms when what is about to happen has not happened yet, but has moved close enough to be felt. Then the sound came from outside, from far enough away to be almost nothing at first, then building, then filling the lot the way a weather front fills a valley from every direction at once, arriving in the body before the source is identifiable. The kind of sound that has weight before it has a location, the kind that the sternum receives before the ears process it. Curtis's eyes went to the front window. The first headlights swept across the glass, then 4 more immediately behind them, then 3 more, then 2. And by the time the last set came around the lot entrance and added itself to the line forming across the front of Bowen Auto and Repair, the entire front of the building was illuminated from outside in a way it had not been since the night Earl Bowen first turned the bay lights on in the autumn of 1988. 23 motorcycles. They entered the lot without hurry and took positions in a line along the front of the property and cut their engines in sequence, the last one going quiet in a silence that landed in the room with the physical weight of something solid. Not one rider dismounted. Not one came toward the door. They sat on their machines in the dark lot in a line engine ticking as they shed heat, headlights cutting through the shop windows and laying rectangles of light across the concrete floor that Della had swept that morning before opening. And they waited with the patience of people who have nowhere else they need to be and no reason to rush anything because they already know the shape of how this ends. Curtis stood with the gun barrel against Grady's sternum and looked at 23 silhouettes on 23 motorcycles and felt the full weight of what he had walked into tonight arrive on him all at once, the way a cold front arrives when the barometric pressure has been dropping long enough that the body has stopped registering the change, and then the front arrives and the body feels the total sum of what it had been acclimating to without realizing it. He had done the math when he walked in. He had been careful. He had been thorough. 1 woman, 1 register, a set of car keys on the hook inside the bay door, an old man in a corner chair who did not warrant inclusion in any accounting of the room's relevant elements. He had not accounted for any of this. His arm was still extended, the gun was still pointed, but something essential had gone out of the configuration, some quality that the configuration required in order to be what it was intended to be. And the man 12 feet away with the barrel against his chest had known for several minutes that this quality was gone and had been waiting with the specific patience of a man who was exactly where he chose to be for Curtis to arrive at the same understanding. "Who are they?" Curtis said. Something had left his voice that had been in it when he walked through the door. Grady did not answer immediately. He looked out at the lot for a moment, at the 23 riders sitting on their machines in the dark, patient and motionless. Then he looked back at Curtis with the expression of a man who is about to say something that is simply and completely true. "Men who remember," Grady said. Curtis looked at the window, at the silhouettes, at the particular quality of stillness that 23 people project when they are waiting because they have been asked to wait, which is a different quality from the stillness of people who are waiting because they have nothing to do. He looked back at Grady. Grady's hand came up from his side, slowly, at a pace that left room for any of several decisions Curtis could still have made. Curtis watched it come up and did not make any of those decisions. Grady took the gun out of Curtis's hand. Curtis's fingers opened and the gun was gone, and he stood with his hand at his side and the complete accounting of the past 23 minutes arriving in him all at once. He had walked into the shop with a system he had built carefully over 6 years and tested in 11 rooms and found reliable in every one of them. 11 rooms where the person he came in for had made the rational calculation that cooperating was preferable to the available alternative and had cooperated accordingly. 11 clean exits, 11 confirmations that the system worked. He had walked into the room where the system was always going to fail. Not because of the gun, and not because of the 23 motorcycles in the parking lot, because of a 61-year-old man in a flannel shirt who had looked at a woman working alone on a dark stretch of highway and had decided 6 months ago on a Wednesday evening in April that she deserved to have someone stay. That was the element Curtis's assessment of the room had missed. That was the only element that had ever mattered. Grady placed the gun on the counter behind him. He looked at Curtis for a moment, not with anger and not with satisfaction, with the steady quality of a man who has done what he came to do and who is simply present now for what follows. "Sit down," Grady said. Curtis sat in the chair Grady had been occupying when they walked through the door, with the paper coffee cup still on the armrest. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and said nothing. Grady went to the counter phone. He called 911 and gave the address and reported 3 individuals and an altercation, and stated that no one required emergency medical care beyond a wrist that should be examined. He gave his name when asked and spelled it without being prompted to do so. He went back to the corner chair. He picked up the magazine from the table where he had placed it when he stood up. He set it in his lap and did not open it. Della had not moved from the pegboard wall. Her back carried the impression of the hooks. Her hands were not yet at their normal temperature. She was looking at the old man in the flannel shirt who was sitting in the chair with his hands flat on the closed magazine, waiting for the police with the unhurried composure of a man waiting for something he has arranged and knows is coming. She was thinking about the wrench on the table. She was thinking about the April evening and about what he had said and about the way he had said it, not as a promise and not as a favor and not as anything that required her acknowledgement or his pride, just as a condition. The way you describe a condition that exists whether or not anyone names it. If there is ever a night someone comes in here and you need someone to not leave. She had put the wrench upside down without looking at it. He had stood up without looking at her. Between those two moments, there was something she did not have a name for in any language available to her, but which she understood as completely as she understood anything she had learned in this shop. Outside, the first siren came down Route 9 at 10:14. Then a second, the red and blue began turning in the windows. Detective Ruth Farley arrived at 10:22. She parked at the edge of the lot and stood for a moment looking at the 23 motorcycles before she walked in. She read the room the way she read every room she entered professionally, in one pass, taking in Marcus on the floor and Odell at the wall and Curtis in the chair and the gun on the counter and the broken glass at the entrance and the old man sitting in the corner and the woman against the pegboard. She spoke to the responding officers. She walked through the shop slowly. Then she walked to the corner chair. She stood in front of Grady and looked at him with the extended attentiveness of someone working to place a face that exists in memory without clear context. "Iron Ridge," she said, not as a question. Grady looked at her and said nothing. "My father worked property crimes in this county," Farley said. "From 2001 through 2007, and then organized crime for 2 more years after that. He mentioned your name twice across those 9 years. Both times in the way a person mentions something that carries more weight than the immediate context requires. Both times like he was being careful about the weight he was placing on the name." She looked at him steadily. "He retired 6 years ago," she said. "He told me before he retired that there were names from those years that did not fit neatly into any of the standard categories. Yours was one of them. He said it without elaboration, and I did not ask for elaboration because I understood from the way he said it that elaboration was not something he was offering." Grady held her gaze and did not fill the space she left. Farley held the gaze for another moment. Then she made a note in her book and closed it. "I will need statements from both of you," she said. "Tomorrow morning is fine." She turned toward the door and stopped without turning back around. "The wrench on the work table," she said. "Upside down. That is not an accident, and it is not how you put a wrench down when you are finished with it. She waited a moment. She walked out. Outside, the 23 motorcycles started their engines one by one and pulled out of the lot in the order they had arrived, headlights moving across the front windows one final time, and then continuing south on Route 9 until the sound of them was gone. Within 5 minutes, the lot was empty, and the night was as quiet as it had been before they came, the quiet of a highway edge after the last vehicle has passed, which is a specific kind of quiet that carries in it the memory of what it replaced. Della stood in the middle of her father's shop and listened to the quiet. She looked at Grady, who was in the corner chair with the magazine on his knee and the coffee cup on the armrest, in the specific quality of settled ease that a person has when they are in a place they have chosen to be. She looked at the pegboard wall and the empty hook where the 1991 wrench had hung before Marcus drove her into the wall and brought it down. The wrench was on the floor near the baseboard. She would rehang it before she locked up. She looked at the work table, at the 19mm combination wrench lying upside down in the spot where she had placed it, without looking at it in the motion she used for every tool in this shop on every day she worked here. She walked to the table. She picked up the wrench. She turned it right side up and set it back where it belonged. Then she collected her shop rag and began closing out the evening in the order it needed to be closed out because there was work to do, and she was the one who did it, and that had not changed tonight and would not change. The investigation took 6 weeks. Curtis Vane's phone was the instrument that opened it. Not a sophisticated device, not an encrypted system, not the kind of careful record-keeping architecture that someone with his operational patience might have been expected to use. But Curtis had been organized in the specific way of a man who believes his records will never be examined, which is to say he had kept careful track of things he trusted no one would ever look at. Locations, dates, approximate amounts taken, notes, in his own shorthand on which business owners had cooperated immediately and which had required what he called additional persuasion to arrive at cooperation. 11 entries in total across 3 states. Wyoming, Colorado, a single job in western Nebraska that detectives in that state had been carrying as an unsolved case for 14 months and had, by the time Curtis's records surfaced, begun to suspect might remain unsolved indefinitely. Detectives in Cheyenne and Laramie pulled security camera footage from the locations identified in Curtis's phone records. Business owners who had paid and then stayed quiet, who had made the calculation that drawing further attention to what had happened to them was likely to produce outcomes less favorable, then silence found suddenly that there was someone willing to listen and a reasonable expectation that talking would not make their situations worse. 7 of them gave formal statements in the first week of the investigation. 3 more followed before the end of the second week. The most detailed account came from a woman named Patrice, who had owned a tool rental shop in Laramie and who had sat in her office chair and stared at the wall from the moment Curtis and his men walked out until she was certain they were not coming back. She had memorized the license plate of their vehicle while they were still inside. She had memorized it deliberately as a conscious act because her father had told her when she was young and starting out in business that a woman alone in a commercial space needed to develop the habit of recording what could be recorded and remembering what could be remembered, because you never knew which details would matter and which would not, and the cost of recording them was always less than the cost of not having them when they were needed. Ruth Farley coordinated the Wyoming portion of the investigation from the Sheridan office. She drove to Bowen Auto and Repair on the Wednesday morning following the incident to take Della's statement, arriving at 9:30 with her notebook and the specific manner she brought to everything she did professionally, which was direct and without wasted motion. She sat across the counter from Della, the same counter where Della stood every morning to open the register and start the day, and Della told her everything she remembered in the order she remembered it. She did not soften any of it, and she did not add the editorial texture that people sometimes apply to accounts of things that happened to them because they believe the unadorned version will not be taken seriously. When she finished, Farley set her pen down. "There is something I want to ask you about directly," Farley said. The responding officer's notes mention a strip of paper in the register drawer. He noted it but did not collect it. "I would like to see it." Della had not forgotten the paper. She had been aware of it in the background layer of her attention throughout the evening of the incident and through the portions of the night that had been available for sleep afterward. She opened the drawer beneath the cash tray. The strip of notepad paper was where she had placed it under the monthly bank statement she had set on top of it beside Earl's spare key to the back door, next to the photograph that had been in the drawer when she went through it after his death. She handed Farley the strip of paper. Farley looked at it. She wrote something in her notebook. "When did you write this down?" she said. "2 Sundays before the incident," Della said. A sedan came past the lot after closing. Same slow pass twice in the same evening. Different directions. My father taught me to write down what felt wrong before I had time to reason myself out of it. So I wrote it down and put it away. Farley looked up from the notebook. She let the silence sit for a moment, which Della recognized as a technique rather than an absence of response. "Earl Bowen taught you that," Farley said. "He kept a notepad on the shelf under the register for 35 years, Della said. Not for shop business, for the other kind of things. The car that stayed in the lot longer than it had a reason to. The person who asked questions about the hours when the hours were on the door. He said the habit of writing down what felt wrong before you could second-guess yourself was the difference between having the information when you needed it and not having it when it was too late." Farley ran the plate that afternoon. The plate came back to a rental. The rental came back to a name, and the name connected across the following 10 days as carrier records and hotel registrations and fuel purchase receipts were assembled and cross-referenced to the phone Grady had given to the responding officers and to each of the 11 prior locations in Curtis's own records, placing Curtis's presence at each location on each date within a margin of error that the prosecutor described in her notes on the case as effectively zero. The strip of notepad paper Della had written on a Sunday evening 2 weeks before the incident and placed in a drawer and not thought much about subsequently became the second piece of physical evidence submitted to the prosecutor's office. The first was the phone. Curtis Vane was charged with 11 counts of armed robbery, 2 counts of assault, and 1 count of unlawful weapons possession. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. He was convicted on all 14 counts and sentenced to 18 years at the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Rawlins. Marcus entered a plea agreement and received 7 years. Odell entered a plea and received 5. The reduction offered in exchange for testimony that the prosecution accepted, but ultimately did not require. Neither Marcus nor Odell in any of their statements or in any of the conversations that investigators reconstructed from subsequent interviews provided a coherent account of what had happened inside Bowen Auto and Repair on the night of the incident. Specifically, neither was able to explain how 2 men of their respective sizes had arrived on the floor before Curtis Vane had time to respond to the situation. The police report classified the cause as physical altercation with a third party. The third party was described as a 61-year-old male, gray hair, flannel shirt. No prior record. Della reopened the shop 3 days after the Tuesday night. She had ordered the replacement glass panel for the entrance case from a supplier in Casper. The morning after the incident, measuring the opening herself and recording the dimensions on the part's notepad in her own handwriting, because the glass case was simply the next item requiring attention, and she addressed items in the order they required it. The panel arrived on Thursday. She installed it herself. She swept the bay floor twice before she was satisfied with the result. She rehung every tool on the pegboard in the order Earl had established over 35 years of daily use, an order she had memorized without intending to, through the accumulated repetition of working beside him for 22 years. The 1991 wrench that had fallen when Marcus drove her into the wall was rehung on its hook. She tested the hang of it twice and adjusted the hook angle a fraction on the second test until the hang was correct. She was open at 7:30. The regulars came in on their usual days and communicated what they communicated in the way that people in small towns communicate things they consider important, which is directly and without the social padding that larger communities tend to insert between a feeling and its expression. Dale came on the first Friday after she reopened with his pickup, which did not need anything done to it, and left a 50 on the counter. He did not fold it, and he did not explain it, and Della did not ask him to, because they had been exchanging this kind of communication across more than 20 years of mutual acquaintance, and neither of them required the spoken version to understand the content. The bank call came on a Thursday morning 11 days after the incident. She was under a Dodge Ram assessing a transfer case that had been producing a sound its owner described as falling somewhere between a complaint and a question. Her phone showed the bank's main number, and she slid out from under the truck and took the call standing in the bay. The voice was not the collections department. It was an older man who had prepared what he intended to say before he called, She could tell from the deliberate pace of it. He said his name was Gerald Sutter and that he had processed Earl Bowen's original loan application in 1988 and that he had been following the coverage of the arrest with considerable attention. He did not ask how she was doing. He did not offer condolences that had arrived considerably past their useful date. He said he would like to discuss a restructured schedule for the remaining loan balance and named a specific revised interest rate and said the first payment under the new terms would not be due until the first of the following month. He did not make her ask for any of this. Before he ended the call, he said one more thing. "Your father was the most reliable man I ever lent money to, Gerald," Sutter said. "I should have called sooner than this." Della did not cry. She stood in the bay with the phone in her hand and looked at the pegboard wall across from her for approximately 30 seconds. She breathed evenly and looked at the tools hanging in their places and let herself feel what was in the room without trying to name it, because naming it would have required stopping, and she was not yet in a position to stop. Then she crouched back down under the Dodge Ram and finished the assessment. It was not a complaint, she concluded. It was a question. The question was a worn bearing on the output shaft. She wrote that on the invoice and called the owner with the estimate. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She had learned this from Earl, who had learned the practice of it in the years before the shop years that had a name now or the beginning of a name. Iron Ridge, 1985. A young man who had reached a decision about the direction he was pointed in and had made a different choice than most men in his position make, and had taken 3 years to build what he had decided to build instead, and had built it on Route 9 in Sheridan in the autumn of 1988, and had run it honestly for 35 years until the heart that had done that work for a long time finally stopped on a Thursday morning in March. Grady came in the following Wednesday at 9:15, the same time, the same corner chair, the same paper coffee cup. The magazine from the side table was from 2 months back rather than 8, which Della registered as a marginal improvement and assigned without examining the assignment to a category of changes she noticed and accepted without requiring an explanation for. She poured his coffee without being asked and went back to the bay. They did not talk about the Tuesday night, not that Wednesday, and not in the Wednesdays that came after it. There was a version of that conversation that would have required one or both of them to be different people than they were, and neither of them was a different person than they were. And so the conversation did not happen, and the understanding it might have produced arrived instead through the slower and more reliable channel of accumulated proximity and the things that get communicated through it when the people involved are paying attention. On Wednesday afternoons and the quieter hours after the midday appointments, Della sometimes found herself saying aloud what she was working on in the bay, not framing it as a request and not looking for a response, but saying it the way you say things to someone whose presence in a room makes certain kinds of thinking easier. He would listen. He would sometimes say something back that was not advice, but was useful in the specific way that a perspective assembled over a long span of paying attention tends to be useful. Then she would go back to the vehicle. Some things do not require a name in order to be real and to be known by both parties involved. It was 6 months after the incident, in an afternoon in early April, when the lot was quiet and the light through the eastern bay window was the pale, clear gold that Wyoming spring produces in the hours before the temperature commits to the season, that Della went to the back of the shop for a parts box from the storage shelving and found herself standing in front of Earl's tool cabinet. The 4-drawer rolling chest had been against the back wall since before she had memories of the shop. She had maintained it and used the top 3 drawers regularly, taking stock of what was in them and reorganizing occasionally when the contents required it. The bottom drawer she had not opened since the week after Earl died. She had understood, without deliberating about it, that the bottom drawer was Earl's, in the way that certain spaces in a shared life belong to one person, and the other person knows this without the matter being negotiated. After he died, she had let the understanding stand. She opened it. Inside a socket set with 2 pieces missing. A shop manual for a 1970 Chevrolet pickup that had belonged to a truck Earl no longer owned by the time he died. A tin of wheel-bearing grease-dried solid, a receipt from a Billings parts supplier dated November 2011. And beneath all of those, in the back corner of the drawer, placed with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided where it was going to be and put it there and then set the decision aside in the mind with equal deliberateness, 2 items. The first was a leather vest. She lifted it out and held it in both hands. The leather was old and darkened in the way that leather darkens after years of being worn through all the weather that Wyoming produces, creased in the way that things crease when they have been lived in rather than stored. The lining at the left shoulder had been repaired with stitching she recognized as Earl's neat and strong and using exactly the thread required. On the back, a patch. Iron Ridge MC. The colors along the outer edge had faded, but the design was legible and complete and required no interpretation. She held it for a long time. Earl Bowen had been a prospect of Iron Ridge MC in 1985. He had left the chapter and spent 3 years deciding what he intended to do with the decision he had made, and then he had built this shop and run it for 35 years and raised a daughter in it and told her everything about himself that he had decided it was necessary for her to know. He had kept this vest in the bottom drawer of his tool chest. He had never spoken of it. He had never disposed of it. Those two things were not in contradiction. She understood that now. He had left it behind completely and without apparent regret, the same way he had left the chapter itself. And he had not let it go, because letting it go was not the same act as leaving it behind. And Earl Bowen was a man who knew the difference between the things he had moved away from and the things he had moved away from but chosen to keep. She understood this now in a way she could not have understood it before a man she had not asked for had started occupying her corner chair every Wednesday morning and had eventually stood at her work table on an April evening and turned a wrench upside down and said things about her father that her father had not said about himself. The second item in the drawer was a piece of paper, single sheet, folded twice. The narrow-ruled paper from the notepad Earl had used for everything. She had seen his handwriting on 35 years of invoices and estimates, and the occasional note left on the register when he went out and needed her to know where. She had not seen new words in his handwriting in 14 months, and the sight of them in the low light of the back corner of the shop did something that she absorbed without trying to classify it. She unfolded the paper. Earl had not been a man who used more words than the situation required. If you are reading this, something happened. You are handling it the way you handle everything, which is to say you are working and not sleeping enough and not asking anyone for help, because that is not how we were built. I know it because I built you that way, and I am sorry for the parts of that which have made things harder than they needed to be. The man who comes in on Wednesdays. His name is Grady. We were in the same chapter a long time before either of us was what we eventually became. I reached out to him when the bank letters started arriving with the particular tone that bank letters use when the situation is changing. I asked him to look in on the shop, not to interfere with anything, not to explain himself to you or change what is already there, just to be present. Because I know what he is, and I know that his being present in a room is worth more than most things that could be formally arranged. Do not ask him why he stayed. He will not have a ready answer for that, and it will cause him difficulty. He does not deserve difficulty from you. Just let him, your father. Della stood in the back of the shop with the paper in her hands and the vest over her forearm, and the pale April light coming through the eastern window, and was still for a long time. Earl had known about the bank letters, had known about the tone they had been taking, and had known what Della would do about it, which was absorb it and not tell anyone, and add the number to the running list of things she was managing without assistance because she was built the way she was built, and that was how she managed things. He had known this because he was Earl, and Earl had paid close attention to everything for a long time. And he had called Grady Mercer. He had reached across 35 years of silence to a man he had known briefly in a chapter they had both eventually left, and he had asked that man to come and sit in the corner of a building he would not live long enough to protect himself. He had trusted that Grady would come. He had trusted that Grady would understand without being told the full shape of what was being asked and why and what it required of him. Earl had not explained any of this to Della. He had put it in the bottom drawer of the tool chest and folded it twice and placed it under the socket set and the shop manual and the dried-out grease tin and the 2011 receipt, and he had trusted that she would find it eventually when she was ready to open the drawer, which she would not be ready to do until she no longer needed the explanation it contained, which was exactly the kind of timing that Earl Bowen had always understood better than most people. Grady had come because Earl asked. He had stayed because of something that was entirely his own to give and that required no external accounting. Della folded the paper carefully in the same 2 folds Earl had made, set it back in the corner of the bottom drawer, laid the vest flat on top of it with the iron ridge patch facing up, and closed the drawer. She went back to work. She did one more thing with the vest before she closed the drawer for the last time. On a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after she found it, she removed the iron ridge patch from the vest with a seam ripper, working carefully so the backing fabric did not tear. And she mounted the patch on a piece of 1/4-inch plywood she cut to size from a scrap piece she had in the back corner of the bay. She hung it on a nail between the eastern window and the fire extinguisher bracket at eye level, where the morning sun came through the window and caught it directly for the first 2 hours of every workday. She did not explain to anyone what it was or why it was there. The regulars noticed it in the way that regulars notice changes to places they have been coming to for years, and they said nothing about it because the regulars understood that some things in a shop belong to the shop's own account and do not require explanation. Dale noticed it on his first spring visit after she hung it. He stood in front of it for a long moment with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the faded patch. Then he nodded once, a single deliberate nod, the same nod he used when she gave him an estimate that confirmed what he had already expected, and he went to wait by his truck. That was sufficient. That was more than sufficient. The letter from Curtis Vane arrived at Bowen Auto and Repair 1 year and 3 days after the Tuesday night incident in a plain white envelope with a Wyoming State Penitentiary return address in the upper left corner. She read it at the register, standing the way she read everything that came to the shop upright, because sitting implied a duration she might not have. It was 4 sentences. He did not request forgiveness. He did not offer the accumulated history of circumstances and pressures that people in those situations sometimes offer as context, not as excuse he might have said, but as explanation, which is a distinction that Della understood perfectly, and that changes nothing about the accounting. He wrote 4 sentences and they said what they said without the structural softening that people sometimes use to make difficult statements easier to deliver. The last sentence said this: "I chose your stop because I thought you were the easiest target on that road. I want you to know that was the last thing I got wrong about you." She read the letter twice. She folded it the way Earl had folded the notepad paper, twice and flat. She opened the drawer beneath the cash tray and placed the letter inside next to Earl's spare key to the back door, beside the small photograph she had found in the same drawer the week after Earl died. The photograph was of Della at age 7, sitting on an overturned oil drum on a Saturday morning in late September, watching her father paint the letters of the sign on the front of the building. She was watching him with the complete and unself-conscious attention of a child who has not yet understood that she is watching something she will eventually be responsible for carrying forward. She looked at the photograph sometimes when she opened the register in the morning when the shop was quiet and the coffee was still brewing and the day had not yet become itself. She looked at it and at the letter and at Earl's spare key and at the strip of notepad paper she had left in the drawer after the investigation, because it had nowhere better to be. And she understood that all of these things were part of the same drawer, in the same shop, on the same Route 9, in the same Sheridan, Wyoming, and that they belonged there as much as any of the tools on the pegboard, or the wrench on the work table, or the Harley in the back corner of the bay. She did not take the letter out after she placed it there, but she knew it was in the drawer, and knowing it was there was its own kind of reckoning, a fact that had joined the other facts, and that was not going anywhere. Grady Mercer came in on Wednesday mornings for 4 more years. The same time, the same chair, the same coffee, the same magazines which grew marginally more current over the 4 years in improvement, Della observed, and did not comment on the way. She did not comment on many things she noticed and understood. In the 3rd year, in the middle of a July afternoon when the bay was quiet and the lot was hot, and the conversation had drifted the way the Wednesday afternoon conversations sometimes drifted, when the work allowed it towards something adjacent to what they usually said to each other. He mentioned that his knee had been giving him trouble on longer rides. He said it the way he said everything factual as information, not as a complaint and not as an invitation to express concern. Della noted it the way she noted everything he said, which is to say she held it in the back layer of attention where things waited until they were relevant to something actionable. In the 4th year, the rides grew shorter. She could tell by the temperature of the engine when he arrived. He did not mention this, and she did not ask. There are things you read from the temperature of what you are working on. On a Wednesday morning in November of the 4th year, Della arrived at the shop at 6 to open up. She unlocked the bay and turned the lights on and started the coffee, and opened the service log to the day's appointments. 7:30 came, 8, 8:30, 9. At 9:15, the lot was empty. She stood at the register and looked out at the lot through the front window for a moment. Then she went to the bay and started on the first vehicle of the day, a Subaru Outback with an exhaust leak that its owner had described over the phone in terms that suggested she had been listening to it worsen for several weeks and had finally decided the sound was not going to resolve on its own. At 12:15, when she walked out to her truck to retrieve a box of gasket material from the cargo bed, she found the envelope under the driver's side wiper blade. White envelope. Her name on the front in handwriting she recognized without having to look at it closely. The same handwriting from 4 years of service, log signatures. The handwriting of a man who wrote with the deliberate clarity of someone for whom clarity in writing was a form of respect for the person reading. Inside, a single key on a plain ring, a piece of paper folded once. 4 words. Take care of her. She drove to Elm Street after she finished the exhaust repair. The storage facility was the third unit from the eastern end of the row. She opened the roll door and waited for her eyes to adjust to the interior light. The Harley was there, covered with the canvas tarp she had seen him use in weather, the same tarp, the same motorcycle she had serviced on more Wednesday mornings than she could count without going through the service log. She lifted the edge of the tarp and looked at the tank and the chrome and the leather of the seat. The machine had been maintained with the consistency of someone who understood that neglect accumulates in things the way rust accumulates gradually and then suddenly, and who had chosen not to allow it. The tank was full. She replaced the tarp and arranged to have the bike transported to the shop that afternoon. She cleared a space in the back corner of the bay, not the primary space near the lift, and not anywhere that would put the machine in anyone's path, but a space that had good light from the eastern window. The window that in November let in the low-angled morning sun at the precise angle that made the chrome gleam, the way chrome gleams in photography, but rarely in ordinary light. She rolled the Harley into the space and set it on its stand. She did not ride it. It was not hers to ride, and she was not in the habit of taking things that were not hers, regardless of the terms under which they had been given. She did not sell it. The possibility arrived briefly and was not entertained the way you decline to entertain a thought that belongs to a category of things you have already settled. She kept it in the corner with the good morning light, where she could see it when she looked up from the register or from the bay floor or from anywhere in the shop that had a sight line to the back corner. The way Earl had kept the photograph in the drawer. The way the iron ridge patch now hung between the window and the fire extinguisher bracket where the morning sun hit it directly for the first 2 hours of every workday. Some things you do not explain. You place them where they can be seen and you let them be what they are. There is a particular kind of person the world keeps misreading consistently and across enough context that the misreading must be understood as systematic rather than incidental. They do not present themselves in ways that register as significant. They do not take up extra space or issue announcements or provide advance notice of what they are about to do. They have been to every place that the accumulated weight of consequence and loss and the specific experience of outlasting things you expected to outlast you can take a person. They have come back from all of it and they have made a decision, private and quiet and not subject to revision, to put down what they were and become something smaller and more specific, to occupy a corner chair, to drink the available coffee, to return every Wednesday morning, not because anything is owed and not because anything is expected in return, but because showing up steadily and without performance and without any expectation of acknowledgement is the thing they have left that is worth giving, and they have decided it is worth the giving. The world looks at those people and makes an error. The error is understandable. The world is organized around things that announce themselves, and these people do not announce themselves, and so the world files them in the wrong category, the category of things that are present but not relevant, and proceeds accordingly. That is the world's error, not theirs. Earl Bowen had not made that error. Earl had looked at a man he had known briefly in a different chapter of a different life across 35 years of intervening silence. And he had seen him clearly, which is to say he had seen not the flannel shirt and the bad coffee and the 8-month-old magazines, but the man inside that presentation and what that man actually was and what that man's presence in a room actually meant. He had trusted what he saw enough to make a phone call he could not follow up on, to ask a favor he would not live to see honored or denied, to write a note. He would not be present to deliver and to place it in the bottom drawer of his tool chest in the expectation that the person he had written it to would find it when she was ready to find it, and that finding it would tell her what she needed to know. He had been right. Grady Mercer had arrived in Sheridan on a Tuesday in October with one bag and one motorcycle and the particular kind of forward momentum that runs out when a man has been moving long enough in a direction that has no meaningful destination. He had stopped because Sheridan was where the stopping happened. He had stayed for 4 months before a Tuesday ride east on Route 9 brought him to the sign on the building and stopped him there for 20 minutes and brought him through the door. For 7 years, total 3 before Earl's call, and 4 after the incident on the Tuesday in October, he had sat in the corner chair every Wednesday. Not because of the chapter, not because of the things he had been and done in the 20 years he had spent in Iron Ridge. Things that had required no documentation precisely because documentation would have been their own category of consequence. Not because of debt or obligation or the logic of what he owed to what Earl had once been to him. Because he had looked at a woman alone in her father's shop on a dark and empty stretch of Wyoming highway and recognized in her something he understood from the inside of his own experience. The specific weight of holding something together by yourself in the full knowledge that you are not entirely certain you can hold it, without telling anyone about the weight, without asking anyone to share it. Because that is simply the shape of how you were made, and you have not yet been shown a reason sufficient to become a different shape. He had stayed because that weight deserved a witness, not someone to take it from her, not someone to intervene between her and the carrying of it. A witness. Someone who knew the weight was there and chose consistently and without requirement and without expectation of return to be present in the same room with it. And because Earl Bowen had built something on this lot on Route 9 in Sheridan, Wyoming, that was worth witnessing and protecting and continuing. And Earl Bowen was no longer in the world to do any of those things himself, and the daughter he had built it for was already doing. All of them had been doing all of them since the Thursday morning. She finished the brake job before she drove to the hospital and would keep doing them as long as the building stood and the coffee was in the pot and the tools hung on the pegboard in the order Earl had established. Della understood this, not all at once and not in the single moment of finding the letter in the bottom drawer. The understanding had been assembling since the April evening when Grady stood at the work table and turned the wrench upside down and said the word chapter for the first time in this shop, and it continued assembling through everything that followed. Through the October night and the investigation in the restructured bank payment, in the letter from Curtis Vane and the vest in the bottom drawer, and the 4 words under the wiper blade, and it would continue assembling for a long time after all of those things, because that was how understanding worked, when the thing being understood was large and had many parts. She kept the corner chair clean. She kept coffee in the pot on Wednesday mornings starting at 7, which was earlier than she had started it before, and which she did not explain to anyone who noticed. She kept the magazine table supplied with issues no more than 2 months old, because that was the standard she had arrived at on the first Wednesday after she found the envelope. And she maintained it the way she maintained everything in the shop, not by deciding each time to do it, but by having decided once and allowing the decision to carry forward. She kept the 19mm combination wrench on the work table beside the register, in its place. The place Earl had given it, and she had maintained for 22 years of working this floor beside him. Right side up because the shop was open and the work was happening and the lights were on and everything was as it was supposed to be. But her hand knew where it was. It had always known. And in the way that knowledge moves from the mind into the body, through enough repetitions of a practice, she knew that her hand could find it in the dark in a moment that left no time for deliberate searching in the single motion she had used on the Tuesday night in October, when the hooks were in her back and her feet had not fully found the floor. And the most important thing she could do in that moment was the next thing, which was to put out the signal and trust that someone would answer. She had put out the signal. Someone had answered. That was what Earl had given her. Not the building, though he had given her the building. Not the tools, though he had given her those too, every one of them. Not even the debt, which was now being retired on a schedule she could manage one payment at a time, in the way that every obligation that is going to be honored gets honored eventually by being addressed consistently and without drama across the span of time required. What Earl had given her was the practice, the habit of attention, the notepad under the register, The discipline of writing down what felt wrong before the reasoning could catch up and talk her out of it. The understanding that most of what goes badly in a situation begins with someone failing to know precisely what they are dealing with, and that the way to know precisely is to look carefully and record honestly and do the work of understanding rather than waiting for understanding to arrive. And the wrench, always the wrench, in its spot, available. Upside down when something is wrong, and the most important thing is that someone stays. Right side up on all the other mornings, which is most mornings. The ordinary mornings when the coffee is ready at 7 and the first appointment arrives at 8 and the bay door goes up and the light comes in from the east and the work begins in the way work begins when someone has decided to keep showing up. Most mornings are those mornings. Most days are built from those mornings. That is most of a life. That is enough. There were things about running a shop alone that nobody had told Della, not because Earl had been careless in his preparation of her, but because some things cannot be told. They can only be arrived at through the accumulation of days that are each individually manageable and that together add up to a weight you did not notice assembling until it was already there. The first winter after Earl died had been the hardest, not because of the cold, which she knew and had always known, and not because of the mechanical demands of the season, which were predictable and well within her capacity. It had been hard in the way that the first version of any familiar thing is hard when the person who made it familiar is no longer present. The shop was the same shop. The tools were in the same places. The customers came on the same days with the same vehicles and the same concerns. But the quality of the silence in the building had changed in a way she could not have articulated to anyone who asked, and that she did not try to articulate because articulating it would have required her to stop moving long enough to examine it, and stopping was not something she had the time or the inclination to do. She had kept the shop open 6 days a week throughout that first winter. She had kept her father's hours because she did not see a reason to change them, and because changing them would have felt like a statement she was not ready to make. She had performed every service Earl had performed at the same standards and with the same methods, and she had charged what Earl charged and paid what Earl paid and maintained the relationships Earl had maintained with suppliers and customers in the bank. With the exception of the bank relationship, which was changing regardless of what she did, because the numbers were changing and the numbers were doing what numbers do when they are moving in one direction. And the distance between that direction and the direction you need them to move in is growing. She had not slept well that first winter. This was not something she told anyone because there was no one to tell who could do anything about it, and she had not yet developed the habit of sharing things for their own sake. The way some people share things simply because carrying them alone is more difficult than carrying them with someone present who knows they exist. She had not learned that habit yet. She would learn it gradually. Over the 4 years of Wednesday mornings that followed the April evening, when Grady Mercer stood at the work table and turned the wrench upside down and began saying things she had not expected to hear. The sleep improved incrementally and without announcement across the months after that April evening. She did not make the connection directly at the time. She made it later, looking back, which is when most connections of that kind become available. She had learned other things about running a shop alone. She had learned that the physical work, the actual mechanical labor of diagnosing and repairing and maintaining the vehicles that came through the bay door, was the easiest part. She had been trained for it by the best teacher she knew, and the training had been comprehensive and practical and held up under the conditions of actual use. What she had not been fully trained for was the other work. The work of being the person the shop existed in relation to, of maintaining in herself the qualities that made the shop what it was, the reliability and the attention and the specific quality of honest dealing that Earl had built the reputation on over 35 years. This was harder than the mechanical work, not because it required more technical skill, but because it required a different kind of resource, the kind that does not come from a manual and does not improve simply through repetition. And that is in some fundamental way related to the question of who you are in the times when no one is watching, and the question of whether who you are in those times is the same person who appears when someone is watching. Earl had been that same person in both conditions. Della knew this because she had watched him across many years, including years when she was not certain he knew she was watching, and he had been identical. She had decided without framing it as a decision to hold herself to the same standard. Some decisions are not made consciously. They are simply the expression of what you have absorbed from the people you have been closest to across the span of your formation. And they present themselves not as choices, but as the only available option. This was how she had come to be in the shop on the Tuesday evening in October at 9:47, when the glass case went in and Curtis Vane came through the door with Marcus and Odell behind him. It was where she was supposed to be. It was where she had always been. The spring before the incident had been unusual in one respect, that Della had registered without knowing what to make of it, which was that the shop had begun to develop a Wednesday morning quality distinct from any other morning of the week. This was not a quality produced by the work itself, because the work on Wednesday was no different from the work on Tuesday or Thursday. It was produced by the presence of the man in the corner chair, or more precisely, by the knowledge that the man in the corner chair would be there, a knowledge that had a specific effect on the texture of the morning that she noticed without examining closely, the way you notice a change in the quality of light in a room without necessarily looking for its source. She had not told anyone about this either. It was not the kind of thing she had a vocabulary for, not in the context of her own life, and she was sufficiently Earl's daughter that she did not attempt to construct a vocabulary for things she did not already have a vocabulary for. She let it be what it was, which was a quality, and she let the quality be present in the Wednesday mornings without making demands on it. She thought about it once in February of the year before the incident, on a Wednesday evening, after Grady had gone and the lot was empty, and she was closing out the register by the light of the single fluorescent tube above the counter that had been flickering for 2 weeks, and that she kept telling herself she would replace and had not yet replaced. She thought about the quality the Wednesday mornings had acquired, and she thought about where it came from, and she thought about what it said about her, that she noticed it and that it mattered to her in the quiet way it did. She thought about it for approximately 4 minutes. Then she turned off the register light and set the alarm and drove home on Route 9, noting the frost on the margins of the road and the clear February sky above the valley, and the particular cold that Wyoming February produces at 9:30 in the evening, on a clear night when the temperature has been falling since before the sun went down. She replaced the flickering tube the following morning. Curtis Vane, in the period between his assessment of Bowen Auto and Repair as a suitable target and his decision to act on that assessment, had also been learning things about the nature of the work he did. Not things that would have led him to any different conclusion about the shop or about the woman working alone in it after dark on Route 9. The things he was learning were about the nature of certainty itself, specifically about the relationship between the certainty a system produces when it works consistently and the question of whether that certainty reflects a genuine understanding of the conditions or simply the absence so far of conditions the system was not designed for. He would not have framed the question in those terms. He was not a man who spent time on epistemology. But the question was present in him in the way certain questions are present in people who are not in the habit of asking them, as a vague unease that they assign to other causes, and that does not become legible as the question it actually is until something specific makes it legible. What made it legible for Curtis Vane was the 3 seconds after he grabbed Grady Mercer by both shoulders. He had not assigned those 3 seconds any specific anticipatory content. He had walked toward the old man in the corner chair in the same mental register in which he walked toward every element of every room that required addressing, which was competent and efficient and unhurried. He had reached for Grady's shoulders in the same way. The 3 seconds that followed were the first 3 seconds in 6 years of operational work that had not proceeded in the direction that the same 3 seconds begun in the same way had always proceeded. He was sitting in the chair with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the floor before he had fully processed what those 3 seconds had contained. He was sitting in the chair when the accounting arrived slow, and then all at once, and the accounting was not one he had any preparation for receiving. He sat in the chair and looked at the floor and said nothing, and waited for the police in the way a man waits when the room has been decided and the deciding has not gone in his direction, and the only remaining question is what waiting looks like. He thought in the time between Grady's instruction to sit and the arrival of the sirens about the strip of paper he had not seen. He did not know about the strip of paper. He did not know it existed. But sitting in the chair with the full accounting of the evening arriving in pieces, he found himself thinking about what he had not seen on the 2 occasions when he had observed the woman standing at the front window watching Route 9. He had seen her watching. He had seen her turn away from the window and return to the register. He had not seen what she did at the register. He thought about this without it resolving into anything specific. He did not know what there was to know about the strip of paper. He only knew sitting in the chair that there was something he had missed and that whatever it was had been there the whole time, and that the system he had trusted to identify what mattered in a room had not identified it. He thought about this for a long time. He would continue thinking about it with increasing clarity across the months that followed and the years that followed those, and the thinking would eventually produce the 4 sentences he wrote on a plain piece of paper and addressed to the shop on Route 9 in Sheridan, Wyoming, 1 year and 3 days after the evening of the incident. The 4 sentences were the most accurate accounting he had been able to produce. He was reasonably certain they were insufficient. He wrote them anyway because insufficient accounting was better than no accounting, and because not writing them was not an option he was able to make peace with across the year it had taken him to arrive at the point of writing them. He chose your stop because I thought you were the easiest target on that road. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about the most basic element of his assessment, the element on which every other element was built. He had looked at the shop and the woman and the empty lot and the dead street lamp and the closed bait shop a quarter-mile east, and he had assembled a picture that was accurate in almost every detail and wrong in the one detail that mattered, which was the old man in the corner chair who had been there the whole time, who was there on every visit Curtis made to scout the location, who was still there when Curtis came through the door, and who had never registered in Curtis's accounting of the room as anything other than something present and irrelevant. That was the error, the first error, the one that made all the other errors inevitable. And the error was not a failure of observation. Curtis had observed correctly. The error was a failure of interpretation, specifically the interpretation of what it meant for a 61-year-old man to be in a corner chair of an auto shop at par 947 on a Tuesday evening, reading a magazine, drinking coffee from a paper cup, doing nothing that signaled significance. The significance was not in any of those things individually. It was in the accumulation of them and in what the accumulation pointed toward, which was a decision. Not a decision to be present in any dramatic or assertive sense. A decision to be present consistently, without drama, without announcement, in the specific and unglamorous way that real presence requires, which is to show up when you said you would, and to stay when staying is what is needed, and to not require the staying to be acknowledged in order to continue. That decision was what Curtis had missed, and that decision was, as he now understood with the clarity that only certain kinds of reckoning produced, the only thing in that room that had ever mattered. He wrote this in the 4 sentences as precisely as 4 sentences would allow. He folded the paper, he gave it to the guard for processing. He did not know if it would reach its destination or if it would mean anything to the person it was addressed to if it did. He found that he hoped it would. That was as far as he could determine the first genuine hope he had held in the direction of anyone other than himself in a very long time. He sat with the feeling of it in the specific quiet of the cell and did not try to make more of it than it was, which was small, and did not try to dismiss it as nothing which it was not. He let it be what it was. Outside the cell window, the Wyoming sky was doing what the Wyoming sky does in the hours before dawn, which has become a particular shade of dark that is not quite black and is not yet anything else. A shade that exists only in that specific window of time, and that is, if you are in a position to observe it without other demands on your attention, quietly remarkable in the way that simple and unrepeatable things are remarkable. Curtis Vane observed it. He had nowhere else to be. What Della knew about her father after she found the bottom drawer and read what it contained was that Earl Bowen had understood several things about the nature of protection that most people in her experience did not understand. The first was that protection was not primarily a physical fact. It was a relational one. The physical facts mattered, and Earl had not been naive about them, had not been the kind of man who believed that goodwill alone was sufficient against the specific categories of harm that could find a woman alone in a building on a dark stretch of highway. He had been practical about physical facts the way he was practical about everything. He had installed the security system and the exterior lighting and the deadbolt on the back door and the camera above the register that faced the entrance. He had taught Della to park her truck close to the side door, so the walk to it at the end of the evening was minimal. He had told her in the plain and informational way. He told her things that mattered, that the notepad under the register was for things that felt wrong, and that the habit of writing them down was not paranoia but attention. And that attention was one of the few things that could not be taken from you by someone who did not know you had it. But the physical facts were not in Earl's understanding of the situation the primary protection. The primary protection was the relational one. The knowledge held by someone outside the shop that the shop existed and that someone in it might need the specific thing that that external person was equipped to provide. Not money and not formal intervention, and not the kind of help that requires a relationship to be named and categorized and maintained through official channels. Just presence. The knowledge of presence, the availability of presence held in reserve, accessible through a signal so simple, it required no words and no explanation, and no relationship that had been formally negotiated. An upside-down wrench on a work table. Earl had understood this because he had come from a world where this understanding was operational rather than theoretical, where the signal and the response were not a metaphor, but a practice refined through use across many situations by people who understood that the situations where you needed someone to stay were precisely the situations in which you could not ask for staying in any ordinary way. He had left that world. He had left it completely and without apparent regret, and had built a different world in its place, a world of invoices and customers and honest labor, and a daughter who knew how every single thing in her world worked. But he had carried the understanding with him, the way you carry certain things that belong to what you were before you became what you are not, as nostalgia and not as attachment, but simply as knowledge. The kind that has been earned through enough experience to be reliable, and that does not stop being reliable simply because the context in which it was earned has been left behind. He had put the knowledge to use one final time in the months before his heart stopped on a Thursday morning in March by making a phone call and asking a question and trusting that the answer would be yes. The answer had been yes. Della thought about all of this on the mornings when she opened the shop and poured the first coffee of the day and looked at the iron ridge patch on the wall between the eastern window and the fire extinguisher bracket, and at the wrench on the work table, and at the corner chair that had the specific quality of a chair that has been occupied consistently enough to have taken on the character of the person who occupied it. She thought about what it meant that her father had done what he had done, not the calling of Grady specifically, and not the arrangement specifically, but the understanding behind both of those things. The understanding that led a man who had left a chapter 35 years before his death to reach back into that, leaving and extract from it the one thing that was still useful, which was the knowledge of a particular kind of person who provided a particular kind of presence, and to put that knowledge in service of the thing he had built and the person he had built it for. That was Earl. That was who he had always been, even in the years she had not known about, even in the chapter, in the prospect period, and all the things that had happened between 1983, when she calculated he must have been around the age of beginning, and 1988, when the sign went up and the story she knew started. He had been even then a man who understood what things were for and how to use them in the service of what mattered. She had thought she knew who her father was. She had been right about the essential things. She had been incomplete about the rest. She could live with it. She was learning to live with it in the way you learn to live with the discoveries you make about the people you loved most completely, which is not by resolving them, but by letting them expand the picture without displacing what you already knew. The picture was larger than she had known. It contained things she had not been shown. It was still in all the ways that mattered recognizably her father. That was enough. That was in fact considerably more than enough. On a Wednesday morning in the spring of the 5th year after the incident, Della opened the shop at 6, started the coffee, opened the service log, and found that there were no Wednesday morning appointments scheduled. She had not scheduled any. She had not done this consciously. She had noticed in the weeks before that she was no longer scheduling Wednesday morning appointments, and she had noticed it without asking herself why, and the not asking had told her the answer without her needing to examine it directly. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the register counter and one on the table beside the corner chair. She went to the bay and began reviewing the vehicles scheduled for the afternoon. The morning light came through the eastern window at the low spring angle that made the chrome on the Harley in the back corner gleam in the way chrome gleams when the light is right and the machine has been maintained well enough to receive it. The iron ridge patch on the wall caught the same light and held it the way faded things hold light, not by reflecting it perfectly, but by absorbing some of it and returning the rest in a slightly different quality, warmer and less precise. Della worked in the bay, and the coffee and the two cups cooled at the same rate on a morning when the shop was quiet, in the way it was always quiet before the first appointment, which was the specific and comfortable quiet of a place that has been prepared to receive what is coming, and that is in the interval before what is coming arrives simply itself. That was most mornings. That was the thing Earl had built. Not the shop exactly, though he had built the shop. Not the tools or the sign or the customer relationships or even the $47,000 loan that had been restructured and was being retired one payment at a time. He had built the conditions under which most mornings could be what they were: quiet and prepared in themselves and ready for the work. That was what it meant to build something that lasted. That was what it took. Della knew this. She had learned it from him across 35 years of proximity, through the accumulated weight of watching him do it day after day, on the days when it was easy, and on the longer and more numerous days when it was not easy, but when he did it anyway because doing it was what it meant to be the person the shop existed in relation to. She was that person now. She had been in the ways that mattered that person for a long time already. She went back to the bay. She picked up the diagnostic tool. She connected it to the first vehicle of the morning and waited for the readout and read what the readout said and began the work of understanding precisely what she was dealing with, which was always the first step and which was the step that everything else depended on. The coffee cooled in the two cups on the counter and the table. The morning light moved across the floor, the way morning light moves steadily and without hurry, making the shop what it was by the time the first customer pulled into the lot at 8. The wrench was on the work table, right side up, in its place. The bay door was up. The morning was clear and cold in the way of Wyoming mornings in spring, cold enough to be honest, but with the light already past the quality of winter, light already carrying the particular clarity that arrives when the season has turned and the long days are beginning. Della worked in the bay, and the shop was warm from the space heater she had run since 6, and the air carried the smell she had grown up on: cold concrete and old grease and the something underneath that she had never been able to name. And that was simply the shop itself, the specific air of a place that has been worked in honestly for a long time and has accumulated that honesty into everything it is made of. She worked the way Earl had worked. She worked the way she had worked every day for 22 years beside him, and for 14 months since without him, and for however many years remained, which she did not attempt to count and had no need to count, because the number was not the point and never had been. The point was the work in the morning, and the light, and the tools in their places, and the wrench on the work table, and the bay door up, and the coffee in the pot. That was all of it. That was every bit of it. That was enough.